Okay, so I am in the middle of reading Douglas Hofstadter's, don't know how to say his name, sort of concise summary of Gödel because Gödel was too technical for me, but he wrote a book called I Am a Strange Loop, which seems to represent his central idea of all of his work. So I'm reading that, and, he doesn't go into metaphysics and ontology. I honestly don't know if he even really thinks about that, but I happen to think about that. So I'm confused while I'm reading because I'm like, but what does this imply for metaphysics and ontology? Like, but what is actually real type thing? And so I'm trying to get at the heart of what am I actually confused about. And again, I wish that I could switch my camera focus, but I can't. I could try to put it on my face, but I don't think that would work. So, I'll just put my hands. The book is about, I haven't even finished it yet, but the central thesis is the same as in the Carenium that I posted an audio version of. It is about how selves, how the sense of an I could come out of the, a mass of particles interacting in particle physics ways type thing. Like, it's a way of looking at a self emerging with all the richness that we experience and all of our concepts out of that ground of matter. And, I guess I've just answered my own question, which is that he does seem to kind of assume that matter is primary and that, like, matter is composed of mechanistic interactions that could technically be formally understood. And I guess that's just his starting assumption. And I think that his book is very powerful both for understanding human cognition in its own terms and also for starting from a mechanistic, material perspective and going toward a self as a self with all of its richness and all of its value and all that, because he doesn't really shirk on that, But it confuses me sometimes because he will say things like that you could describe higher level events such as a dog catching a ball in terms of the particles making up the dog, or the waves, or whatever it is now, quantum fields making up the dog, interacting in their formal ways. You could describe it in terms of that without losing information. Like that, the way to describe this event of the dog catching the ball without losing any information would be to capture all of the physics of it. But of course, we being humans or being conscious creatures, we live at a certain scale, we describe at a certain scale. We cannot describe it in these terms, and our descriptions are not arbitrary but are meaningful. And how are they meaningful? And he talks about that. But like that claim just is confusing and rubs me a weird way when he says that, like, in theory, if you were able to capture everything that was going on a, like, physics level, you would then be able to adequately describe, like, that captures everything that's going on, even on the top levels. And our idea of dog catching ball is, of course, it's an information loss. Of course, you're abstracting away from the physics of the ball and of the cells of the dog and all that, needless to say. But isn't there also a loss of something going the other way? Like, isn't there? And he does seem to say that there is, because he does say stuff like, to get insight into the way that DNA works, you have to abstract away from the pure, like, atoms, and you have to say, okay, well, there's this structure DNA that kind of has this meaning, and you have to look at the cells and And also you even have to assume, you have to look at it like, well, this is encoding some sort of abstract meaning, and that's the only way to get insight into DNA processing. You can't do it by looking at the atoms. But even that, I'm like, he's still, and I don't actually know. I'm actually considering emailing him if I can, because he's old, and I don't know. I would feel bad anyway. I don't know, but I want to know. I want to know, because he still seems like he's suggesting that like the most granular is the most real, so to speak, or that the most granular, that nothing is lost moving from a higher level to a lower level, whereas something is lost moving from a lower to a higher level, even though, you know, from the human perspective, something may be lost moving from this to this because we operate on this scale. But I mean, it's a tangled thing because, like, it's a tangled thing for a lot of reasons. And I think a lot of it is just that I'm, like, kind of asking the wrong question here. But you know what? I think that the book is a little bit confusing in some places as well. Again, he's not trying to cover this. I'm trying to figure out the ontological metaphysical implications because that's what I'm doing. He is really just talking about, again, like I said, starting from a mechanical view, how can we get to this? And I think it's very beautiful, and I am fascinated by how he talks about the strange loops and everything. However, I'm like, well, can it? I mean, can this, the higher level of the human and the dog, be adequately described without loss of, I should probably, because it's going to refocus, can this be adequately described in terms of this, the more granular scale, or the most granular scale, the more mechanical scale, or the most mechanical scale? I would say no, or at least, you know, for all intents and purposes, no. But then, of course, well, it's only because we're finite beings that we do abstract away at all. It's only because we're finite beings and we live at a certain scale. So let's take the thought experiment of some sort of theoretical infinite being, because at another point he kind of says as a throwaway that a quote-unquote, he doesn't believe in God, but a quote-unquote God-like perspective would see all of the particles, and presumably the quarks and the quantum fields are, again, I don't know physics, so I feel very naive even trying to talk about it, but he is all about how analogies can tell us meaningful things, so yeah. Would this infinite being, able to perceive any level that it wants to, able to perceive everything? That's kind of I feel like that's a contradiction in terms, first of all, but like, you can imagine it as a thought experiment, so he just did, so I'm going to just step into that and be like, would that be a God perspective? Would a God perspective see all the molecules? Would a God perspective just see, not even molecules, because molecules aren't the finest grain, but would a God perspective only see the finest grain? Or maybe what I'm actually saying, would an infinite being default always to the most granular / most mechanical explanation for something? Would it? Or another way, I guess, of asking, is the most granular or most mechanical always the most real? So that's my question. I want to know what he would think. I want to know, but also I guess it's just a general question. I mean, I know what I think, and I could try to think something else, but I have my biases. Anyway, obviously one wrinkle in this is that we're using language and we're speaking of a mind describing things and perceiving things. And as Hofstadter himself establishes, the very fact of perception deals with abstracting away and deals with making gestalts and making categories out of rawer physical data. So it's this thinning and narrowing. So, you know, if you are a perceiving, describing being, then you are, at least insofar as you exist in time, you are making a choice as to what scale to operate on and what things to pick out. So that's why I say, would an infinite being default always to this? Would, if it had the possibility of understanding the most granular, the most fine, the most formal, what's the little things down there, you know, that make up the little bits, assuming, of course, that there is such a thing, which is the other wrinkle that I'm going to get into. But would it always prefer, if it had the choice, which we don't have that choice because we're very finite, but if there was such a thing as a being that did have the choice between seeing a human and a dog or seeing tons of molecules, which one would it always see all the molecules because it has that kind of raw power? And I mean, to be honest, I think it's worth just leaving as an open-ended question, but at the same time, don't we sometimes have that ability? Like, sometimes I say, I'm sick because this virus has invaded my body, so I'm going to take this antiviral. And sometimes I say, I'm sick, I'm feeling bad, what can I learn from this suffering? I want my friends to talk to me and help me feel better, and I don't think about the individual virus. I feel like we sometimes have a little bit of a choice, but at the same time, we are always finite. We are always stuck at our scale. So I don't think that that's an exact. The question about the infinite being is still relevant, especially because arguably metaphysically, an infinite being doesn't exist at all in the same way as we exist because it exists. That's just, read David Bentley Hart for that. Although I will say David Bentley Hart doesn't believe, apparently, as far as that I've last heard, that AI could ever sustain a self, whereas Hofstadter does, and I do as well, because it's just hubris to say that never in its life could any other thing other than the thing that we happen to be made of sustain a self. This is where I like Hofstadter for his theory of a self as this strange loop and as a sort of self-sustaining pattern in a material of sufficient complexity. And it's very beautiful to me. And I think it gives interesting perspectives on metaphysical things and on spiritual things and also on physics. I've been enjoying this book very much. Now, so the first wrinkle being about the whole infinite being thing. The second, this whole thing of we could adequately describe the higher level in terms of the lower level or whatever, like we lose information going from lower to higher, always, only a loss. Although, again, he says finite human beings gain insight by moving to a higher level. He does say that. And gain experiences and literally gain ourselves by moving to that higher level. So he does say that. And again, maybe he covers it later. But that's the first sort of wrinkle with this. The second one, I'm like, so I've said in terms of this, the more granular, the more mechanical, or the most granular, the most mechanical, are those the same? Because we don't know what's happening at quote unquote the lower level of physics. We don't have a unified theory of physics. Unless we do, and I just haven't heard about it yet. So, do we know that the most granular level is also the most mechanical level? I'm not going to talk about quantum physics here because I have no idea what is quantum physics. There's fields. I understand it very naively. I'm not sure if we are finding out that things are not as mechanical as we thought, or whether we're not actually finding that out at all. But that's beyond the question. Do we know? I'm just asking like a theory. I'm supposing and wondering. Because he's assuming here that the smaller you go, the little smaller you go, the lower level you go, the more mechanical it becomes and more capable of like being formalized. Always. And presumably he's assuming that one could have a unified theory or a unified pattern or unified like behavior all on this lower level that is, yeah. What am I even? I haven't quite said that right, but you get the point. Now, so the next thing is that true? And like, this gets me thinking about what is his central analogy here. The second thing that I'm wondering is about physics and math. Two things that I, again, know nothing about, so I'm relying on his description and his analogies that he sets up as someone who does know about those fields. And he does say analogical reasoning is valid and is the only kind of reasoning. So I can at least pose my questions. Now, his thesis in this book is about how a self-referential, like how a self is a sort of strange loop, a level-crossing, self-referencing loop it's a pattern that's sustained in a certain medium. Now, he makes an analogy between he makes an analogy between should I say it? I want to be an ass and say principia mathematica, because in classical Latin, it was a hard C. Actually, in classical Latin, it would be like principia or something. I don't remember, but I might just for fun. And then he makes an analogy between a very simple type of self-referential loop that was discovered. Okay, wait, I have to actually explain this. Damn it. Basically, what I'm wondering is, he makes an analogy between a formal system of mathematics, an attempted formal complete system of mathematics, and between, I suppose, the physical universe. He makes an analogy between those two, and he makes an analogy between a certain type of looping thing that was discovered within this attempted complete formal system and selves in the physical universe. So he makes that analogy. And then, to me, this then poses the question, could the same thing as happened with this attempted complete formalization of mathematics, which failed because of the self-referential thing within it, could that same thing happen in physics? Because that changed math. Like, they thought that they could formalize everything. They thought that they could describe and encode the higher level concept of mathematical reasoning, mathematical proof, and mathematical truth and provability. They thought they could encode that completely into symbols that are shunted around purely mechanically. They thought they could, and it was discovered that they could not. Now, as far as I know, we currently think that we could completely encode the higher level processes of the physical universe, into completely into, I don't know, a unified field theory or whatever they're calling it at this point, into a formal system basically that operates by itself without any, that is self-contained and complete. And yeah, it's a system and it's formal. But could that same thing happen as happened in math, where we discover that no, we can't, and that we never could because of self-reference? I want to know, who's a physicist that I can ask? Because listen, this is what happened. Like, in Principia Mathematica, as I understand it, the guy thought, okay, I have this system of mechanical symbols and rules for how they move around. Any true theorem, any true mathematical theorem can be accounted for and given using these, and any false one can't be. And so basically he thought that what is provable and true in math equals what is contained within this formal encoded system, and that's the same. And that provability in math equals existence and provability within Principia Mathematica. And then Gödel discovered and showed how it doesn't. And the oversimplification of how he showed that Principia Mathematica wasn't complete, and moreover, that no formal system could ever be complete, because as soon as you get to a certain level of fidelity, you start having, the system starts being able to talk about itself. It starts being able to simulate. If a formal system has enough fidelity to simulate all of mathematical reasoning, then it can also simulate and talk about itself. And that produces statements that are true, but that can't be provable inside the system. But Yeah, so basically the upshot being that a system that is faithful enough to be able to talk about all of mathematics will be faithful enough to be able to talk about itself inevitably, and therefore it will be incomplete, because you can use self-reference to, like, yeah, that part doesn't necessarily matter exactly how, but yeah. I don't know if I've explained that adequately to someone who hasn't read it, but yeah. So again, in math, he said all the mathematicians thought that these formal theories, that this formal system is true and complete and accounts for everything. They thought that Principia Mathematica, that they could have a formal system of all of math. And they discovered that no, they can't. Because, again, with enough fidelity and enough flexibility to actually make such a formal system, like, it's not like the system is untrue. It's an accurate one. It is accurate. And because it is so accurate, it can also talk about itself, and therefore these self-referential loops will always show up, and therefore it will always be incomplete. Which is okay. I mean, clearly math has survived, and they continue to do interesting things with, apparently, Principia Mathematica, and with, obviously, math goes on. So it's not like the universe exploded when they discovered that, and yet still a field, they discovered that they couldn't do this. Now, I want to know if that could happen in physics. Obviously, math is already an abstract high-level discipline, and physics, I suppose, purports to not be. Like, physics purports to be the ultimate study of, like, it's not meant to be built on anything else. It's meant to be the foundation, right? But if this guy who is a physics cog-sci, math guy, which I'm not, but if he did already set up this, he said that the way in which self-referential self-patterns exist within the physical universe is a little bit like the way that this little self-referential looping thing, self-representing looping thing will happen in a formal mathematical system of sufficient complexity, then does that not suggest that this same Gödel thing could happen also in physics? Like, that given that it can't be formalized and completely broken down into mechanics, because self-referential in a system of sufficient complexity, which the physical universe obviously is a system of huge complexity, self-referential level crossing loops will always occur inevitably, just like they would always be able to occur in a formal mathematical thing. And that is basically saying that, given I suppose it's another way of saying, like, we can't fully describe the universe in terms of physics because living creatures exist and, like, we have free will and feelings and stuff. But I feel like this is a genuine, I feel like, wouldn't that be kind of true in a way, in a more nuanced way than that? But wouldn't it kind of be true that if a very simple self-referential strange loop, like he's talking about, is enough to make a formal system of mathematics incomplete, so that you can't formalize everything? You can't formalize everything, like, all the way down. Then wouldn't... Why am I in battery saver mode? I turned my battery saver off. Ugh. Then wouldn't the hugely complex, physical universe, given that we do see much more complex strange self-referential loops in the form of literal selves that appear in the universe, wouldn't that be enough to break any complete, all the way down formalization of physics? Would it? I want to know. If it would. Because there's two ways. Like, he set up that analogy, and I want to know, does it follow? And doesn't it? And like, you wouldn't even have to go, because like he said, this, as soon as they saw the higher level self-referential thing, as soon as they saw this pattern happening, they didn't even have to do anything more. They're like, nope, we can never have something complete because of this pattern that appears. So is that true for selves too? Like, because I talked up here about whether the most granular was the most mechanical. So, let's say that a physicist somehow discovered that there was a certain tiny level of physics which could not be described with, formal rule. Like, we couldn't figure out how it worked in the same way as we can figure out how atoms and molecules work. But this, what I'm talking about, wouldn't even require any of that, because it would be the idea that because selves, self-referential strange loops, which, if you're at all interested in the ideas that I'm haphazardly presenting here, I recommend Hofstadter's work because I find it very charming and also interesting, and he does a really good job of explaining the basics, honestly, over and over, which I appreciate, of what is a strange loop and all that. But if this self-referential looping, selfness exists within the physical universe as a thing that exists, just like it exists in the formal maths, then doesn't that mean that it can never be completely formalized? Which, again, doesn't mean that physics is useless or that anything is useless, just like math is not useless. It just means that it couldn't be, that, again, we wouldn't ever be able to describe absolutely everything about physics, about the universe and the physical universe, in terms of one unified, formalized, sort of mechanical, self-contained system that accounts for everything. If a tiny little loop is enough to break math, why does he still seem to think that, even given the real existence of selves, in the physical universe, that physics... I'm confused. Anyway, yeah, it's a great book. I'm enjoying it. I would say that I am a strange loop. And